So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Arts and Amherst Initiatives. Oh, hi. Hi. Welcome to our final event of the semester. I am Ellen, for any of you that don't know me, and I'm the Arts and Amherst Initiatives Coordinator. The initiative is a collaboration between arts programs on campus, and it's the mission of the initiative to foster cross-disciplinary arts-centered program at Amherst. To facilitate these cross-disciplinary programs, we biannually provide funding support to faculty and staff-led projects. We also provide free housing to visiting artists in the Bailey Brown House and create our own series of programs each semester. And this year I've had the pleasure of working with Daryl, Jenna, Dwight, and Danielle. Daryl, Dwight, and I will be leaving the steering committee in July and handing off the baton to some new members. We're excited to welcome Assistant Professor of Art and Film and Media Studies, Adam Levine, Assistant Professor of English, Amelia Worsley, and Professor of Music, Eric Sawyer. And Jenna and Danielle will continue working on the steering committee as well. So yeah, I invite you all to get comfy, enjoy some wine and cheese if you got to pick it up. And just another note that I am recording, so if you want to go make dinner and don't want us to watch, then you know, just make the right decision. So I'm going to start screen sharing. So I'm going to start by talking for about 30 minutes about the preliminary research I conducted into the history of the Bailey Brown House and the land that it sits on. I'm realizing maybe I should pin myself. Actually, no, it's fine because I'm sharing screens. Okay, so anyway, so I'm starting with about 30 minutes of talking about the research, and then I'm going to walk through the new virtual tour of the Bailey Brown House, and we'll get to take a look at new and previous art that was on display in the house. And then for the last 15 minutes or so, I'm going to hand off to Dwight, who will talk a bit about how my research connects to research in the field of architectural studies, and he'll also moderate a brief Q&A, fielding questions from you all. I want to extend some thank yous to several people who've been really helpful in this project. Margaret Dakin in Archives and Special Collections for scanning and sending me files from Amherst College Archives. Thank you, Missy, for meeting with me and helping me organize my very scattered thoughts in that moment. Thank you to Dwight Carey and Mike Kelly for providing guidance and direction throughout this project. And thank you to Cynthia Harbison from Jones Library, who also has been really great in sending me materials from Jones Library. And then also some thank yous to people who have helped facilitate the virtual tour component. So Shane Cullen and Danielle, thank you so much for guiding me through that process. And to all the artists who I've been talking with about their artwork that is showcased in the house. So the Bailey Brown House, which sits, here we go. The Bailey Brown House, which sits about here, is home to the Arts at Amherst Initiative's visiting artist residence. And it's also the home of the arts coordinator. So it's been my home for about the past 2 years. I want to start and acknowledge that I and the Bailey Brown House sit on Nonotuck land. And I also want to acknowledge the neighboring indigenous lands and nations, the Nipmuc and the Wapum to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. And as I'll soon show, the history of the Bailey Brown House really extends well beyond the borders of the current property lines. And the story of the Bailey Brown House is also a story of the neighboring lands and people. So while I haven't hosted any visiting artists since last March, as I said, I've continued to live in the Bailey Brown House. And after being here alone for several months, I became curious about the history of the house. Before COVID, I was hosting dozens of artists each month, and when they'd walk into the house, they'd often ask me about the history of the space. And I would tell them Bailey Brown was this math professor, and I'm pretty sure the house is pretty old. And like, there's a cool milk box that's now the mailbox, but that was about the extent of my history on the house. So I wanted to be able to give future visiting artists some history of the space that they were going to occupy, allow that history to resonate during their time in the space. And I also think it's important for the Arts in Amherst Initiative to have some knowledge of the history of the space. So as I started the research, I stumbled on what is still one of my favorite finds about the house. In a letter that sits in the Amherst College archives and special collections, Bailey Brown's son, Ridley Brown, writes to Biddy Martin asking for his childhood home to be officially named the Bailey Brown House. In the letter, he also writes about the bricks that were used to build his childhood home and says that they come from buildings that were demolished in the construction of the Quabbin Reservoir. I was really intrigued by this fact and realized that I had more questions about the home. I wanted to know how this displacement event tied to the Quabbin had affected activities at Amherst College and how stories of displacement and the pursuit of knowledge coexisted in the space. I also wanted to know how many other buildings in Western Massachusetts were connected to the displacement event catalyzed by the Quabbin Reservoir. And I also wanted to just know more about the people who lived in this space before me. I do not have like complete answers to these questions. And this is the first like big historical research project that I took on. And I've learned you sort of modify your questions as you go, depending on what you have available to you. So what I'm going to present are sort of three stories about the history of the home. There's a geologic story, an architectural story, and a story about the people. And I'm hoping that these cross-disciplinary frameworks will allow for the next arts coordinator and steering committee members to pick up the research and direct a project in a way that complements their own research and interests. So this first story is geology, and I bet you all didn't expect that, but here we go. So the story is going to weave together some deep geologic history about the topography and the bedrock. We're going to talk about the geologic and theologic mind of Edward Hitchcock, who lived down the road. And the story is really beautifully illustrated by the drawings of Ora Hitchcock, who was a teacher of astronomy, painting, drawing, and cartography, and who was born in Amherst and married Edward Hitchcock. Edward Hitchcock was the third president of Amherst College and the professor of geology. And as I mentioned, he lived just down the road from this house in what is now the Counseling Center's Hitchcock House. His property likely included the grounds that the Bailey Brown House now sits on. And so I imagine that Ora, Edward, and their family undoubtedly spent time walking and playing on the land that the Bailey Brown House now sits upon. So the bedrock of Massachusetts that lies beneath Amherst College and the Bailey Brown House was formed over a period of about 750 million years as a result of collisions between the ancient continental margin of Laurentia and offshore volcanic island chains. The islands and continent were brought together because of subduction zones that thrusted island chains and little mini continents onto the growing continent of Laurentia. And this eventually formed the supercontinent of Pangaea. 200 million years ago, Pangaea began to rift apart. And in that rifting event, we created the Atlantic Ocean. But this also pulled apart the compacted bands, creating rift valleys, including the Connecticut River Valley. The rifting events allowed for cracks of magma to rise to the surface, and the area flooded the landscape with a layer of molten lava that was hundreds of feet deep. And we can now see this lava in the basalt flows. We can see the basalt flows in the columnar basalt columns in the Holyoke Range, which are here and here. So stomping around between those lava lakes were ancient dinosaurs that left footprints to be discovered by Edward Hitchcock. I was entertained to learn that in 1837, the Springfield Republican would call these creatures the giant turkeys of Professor Hitchcock. About 65 million years ago, around the demise of the dinosaurs, the entire region of mountains and rift valleys had eroded down to sea level, and a huge blanket of sediment rested on top of the bedrock. Glaciers would come and process over the landscape, stripping the bedrock of the sediment blanket. 22,000 years ago, during the last glacial episode, the Laurentide ice sheet rested with 2,000 feet of ice on top of Amherst. And as the ice sheet began to melt, it left behind glacial moraine, which created Long Island, and locally it left behind gravel, sand, boulders, and clay. It created this huge ancient lake that ran from Connecticut all the way up to Canada. And this is a lake that can be seen in the geologic record, but is also part of the oral histories of Indigenous people that lived in the Connecticut River Valley 10,000 years ago. Edward Hitchcock would point to the sediment and see it as evidence of a global biblical flooding event. And this issue of a global biblical deluge was of constant conversation during Hitchcock's career, as he tried to reconcile his fundamentalist Christian beliefs with scientific research. In his 1833 report on the geology of Massachusetts, Hitchcock describes seeing signs of a powerful deluge sweeping from the north and northwest over every part of the state, not excepting its highest mountains. And in this lecture, which is the image we have here, titled "The Geology of the Deluge," Hitchcock explains how organic plant remains support the story of the biblical story of a dove returning from Noah's Ark with an olive tree branch. So he writes first of the scientific evidence that was used to discount this story, that it had been too cold where Noah's Ark came to rest for there to be an olive tree for a dove to go fly out and come back with a branch. But Hitchcock realized that the current climate is not necessarily indicative of the past climate. And so he writes, the study of organic remains has demonstrated that the temperature of the earth in early times was much higher than at present, and therefore the olive might have flourished at the time of the deluge, where now is perpetual frost. So in his research, Hitchcock would work to explain things like how the growing number of species, which at that point was 150 and counting, had fit on Noah's Ark. He would also grapple with the age of the earth, which he knew was formed by events on the order of 1 million years, not thousands, as had been claimed by the theologians of the time. Hitchcock would never end up accepting this concept of ice ages, which had been the true source of the sediments that he saw sweeping north and northwest. So kind of ironically, while Edward Hitchcock never accepted this concept of ice ages, 102 years after his report on the geology of Massachusetts, another geologist named Richard Lugie would honor Edward Hitchcock by naming this gigantic post-glacial lake after him. So when the Laurentide ice sheet rested on top of Amherst, was melting, the meltwaters drained into the Connecticut River Valley. And this drawing by Ora Hitchcock of the boundaries of the Connecticut River Valley provides a rough outline of the region that Glacial Lake Hitchcock covered. So clearly the footprints of the lake were observed by Hitchcock, even if for him it was evidence of a global deluge. 12,000 years ago, Amherst College would have been a tiny island in this giant glacial lake. And the surrounding water would have been a really brilliant turquoise color because of the reflection of light off of glacial flour. And you would have seen like little icebergs calving off into the lake. So the lake existed for about 4,000 years and then finally drained into a river about 12,000 years ago. And the clays and silts that were making the lake turquoise in color would have settled out of suspension onto the floor of the Connecticut River Valley, where they deposited the raw materials that would come to make the bricks that are the Bailey Brown house. So geology's over. You made it. All right. This brings us to our second story, and here we are in architecture. It's a story about construction, architectural styles and influences, and the water that both facilitated the construction and displacement of bricks throughout Western Massachusetts. So 10,000 years ago, after the melting of the glaciers laid down the raw materials for the Bailey Brown house, clays throughout Massachusetts began being used for brick making. And the first brickyard was constructed in 1629 in Salem, Massachusetts. That clay was not only mined to create bricks, but was also used to extract pigments for clay-based paints. Water was key in powering the pre-electric infrastructure of brick making. The waterways were used to move final dried bricks to their construction sites, but they were also used to compress bricks and move around raw materials. In Western Massachusetts, brick homes started to sprout up in the late 1700s, and the first brick home is in Deerfield was constructed in 1799 by one of its wealthiest residents named Asa Stebbins. And Stebbins' selection of brick as a construction material, as well as his choice of a symmetrically designed house with a smooth facade, was quite a departure from the design of earlier Deerfield houses, which had wooden clapboards and these pedimented doorways, like here. Some houses, like the Sheldon House, also had these big asymmetrical roofs, and they were called salt box houses. So the style of Stebbins' home with the balanced and asymmetrical brick structure, the balanced and symmetrical brick structure is characteristic of federal style architecture. And this was extremely popular in the years following the American Revolution. Federal style architecture was inspired by ancient Greek and Roman design as architects chose to associate the new American nation with the ancient democracies of Greece and Republican values of Rome. The Deerfield Academy School building, which was built in 1798, is also an example of federal style architecture. And the Bailey Brown house, which is still 200 years away from construction, would look back at these federal style brick buildings in Deerfield in its own architectural design. So Ora and Edward Hitchcock, who would eventually settle into their home right by the Bailey Brown house, were quite steeped in the early brick construction activity in Deerfield. Edward Hitchcock was born in Deerfield in 1793, so he would have seen the construction of both Deerfield Academy and the first brick home in his town. Ora Hitchcock was born in Amherst, but spent 5 years teaching astronomy, painting, and cartography to young girls at Deerfield Academy. When Edward Hitchcock would eventually become the headmaster of Deerfield Academy, and he would actually grow to quite disdain this federal architectural style. So when he was president of Amherst College, he would oversee the construction of the octagon and the octagonal shaped study that's attached to his house, which is quite a contrast to these early buildings. In the town of Amherst, brick manufacturing started at least as early as 1818 and provided building materials for Amherst College and other local buildings. Since Edward Hitchcock was not yet president and not yet on campus constructing octagons, the first buildings constructed at Amherst were very much in the Federalist architecture style. You can see here, this is South Hall, and it was Amherst's first building. And it's been described as an extreme case of federal style simplicity. The windows are stacked in this 2, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2 pattern. And it's a pattern that's complemented by these tall chimneys. Additional buildings that were constructed in the federal style were North Dormitory, which is just on the other side, and Johnson Chapel. By 1860, there were 70 brickyards in Massachusetts, and the Connecticut River Valley brick manufacturers were quite eager to distinguish themselves from their brick-making colleagues in the Hudson Valley. And so they did so by describing the superiority of their bricks, of course. So in the very popular April 1900 Brick magazine, the author writes that it is claimed here that New England bricks are superior in many respects to those made in the Hudson district, or in fact, than those made in almost any other part of the country. They are said to be more perfect, which is due to greater care exercised in molding, drying, and burning. They are carefully sorted as to color and hardness, so that lots are uniform in color and character. The same issue of Brick magazine goes on to describe the city of Holyoke as an essentially brick city. Nearly all the manufacturing establishments are built of brick, as well as many of the dwelling houses. Nearly all the brick manufactured in this district find a local market. And so despite the plentiful bricks that were being manufactured in Holyoke, somewhat surprisingly, bricks were also arriving from out of town as a result of the creation of the Wachusett Reservoir. So the story of the creation of that reservoir in 1908 and the displacement of people and buildings that rested on the land that would be flooded by the reservoir quite perfectly anticipates the story that comes with the construction of the Quabbin Reservoir in the Swift River Valley. As the population of Boston grew through the 1890s, indoor plumbing became commonplace and the city quickly needed more water. And so to meet this growing need for water, then the Wachusett Dam was created, and it flooded the towns of Boylston, West Boylston, Clinton, and Sterling. And sitting happily in the town of West Boylston was the mill for the West Boylston Company, a textile manufacturer. The reservoir would completely submerge the mill site, so the company demolished their mill in West Boylston and sent some of the bricks by train to East Hampton to build a new mill. Between 1900 and 1907, the West Boylston Company would build a huge complex of mills, many of which integrated bricks from the original mill. Today, the site has been transformed for multiple uses, including artist studios, indoor-outdoor parks, and rental apartments. Eastworks, which is this building on the left, now houses graphic designers, sculptors, writers, and other artists. And so I've come to think of this displaced mill as sort of a parent of the Bailey Brown House. It's a space that has grown to house creative artists in Western Massachusetts. And I also think it was a space that didn't expect that the displacement it experienced would then be experienced by the next generation of buildings. So when the completion of the first reservoir failed to meet Boston's long-term water needs, Boston set its eyes on the Quabbin, or the Swift River Valley. And in 1927, the project was put into action, and this required the relocation of 4 towns, thousands of people, and the exhumation of over 7,000 bodies from cemeteries. And so over 2 decades, the residents of Dana, Enfield, Prescott, and Greenwich were systematically relocated. Their houses were moved or razed, and the graves were exhumed. And I think it's cool to take a look at this map, which draws out the border of the Quabbin, and just see how many roads and how settled the land beneath the Quabbin was. Many of the buildings in these towns were permanently destroyed, but others, including the First Congregational Church of Prescott, and the Amherst College owned property at 41 Lincoln Avenue were reconstructed outside the perimeter of the Quabbin. The Colonial Construction Company of South Deerfield actually made a profession of taking down, of building houses that incorporated materials from buildings that were taken down in the anticipation of the Quabbin Reservoir. So the Bailey Brown House was built in 1932 in the midst of this flooding of the Quabbin Reservoir and the displacement of towns, people, and building materials. I wasn't able to find any record of the systematic distribution of building materials from the Swift River Valley, but the bricks that were used to build the Bailey Brown House likely came from homes or businesses like the ones pictured on the left. Architecturally, the United States was in the midst of the colonial revival style, and this is the period that was dominantly influenced by the federal style architecture that defined the early architecture of Amherst College and Deerfield Academy. So both the Inn on Boltwood, which was built in 1926, and the Bailey Brown House are built in the colonial revival style. This architecture style of the Bailey Brown House marks an attempt to look back at the democratic ideals of the new American nation, while the individual bricks of the home showcase a less romantic story about displacement that I think is just as entrenched in the history of the land. So our final story is about the people who lived in the house and occupied the land that it sits on. I've mentioned some of the characters in the story, Ora and Edward Hitchcock, as well as the Nonotuck people. So I want to begin by reading the Five College Native American and Indigenous Studies statement on the people of Nonotuck. So the statement reads, the Nonotuck are one of the many indigenous groups from Cointica, the Connecticut River Valley. Their territory historically encompassed what is now Hadley and Northampton, and much of the land eastward towards what we now call Pelham Hills. In the early 17th century, English and Dutch forces pitted various Algonquin groups throughout the Cointica against other regional tribes. These wars decimated a population that was already ridden with European diseases to which the indigenous population had no immunity. Due to these beaver wars, as well as the colonial wars of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Nonotuck people folded in with the Abenaki people throughout northern New England and southern Quebec, and have continued journeys through the area. Many have family connections with current Cointica residents. Nearby territories belong to the Nipmuc to the east and the Abenaki to the north. So without being able to go into any archives and look at land deeds, it was really challenging for me to figure out how the specific plot of land on which the Bailey Brown House sits was acquired by the college. And so the following is kind of a piecemeal story of land occupants that now takes a large jump forward to the time of Edward Hitchcock. When Edward Hitchcock was teaching at Amherst College, he lived, as I said, just a few steps away from what would become the Bailey Brown House. The 1840 census shows that there were 9 people living on the property with Edward Hitchcock, which suggests that all but one of them are pictured in this painting on the left. The painting, which is currently on view in the Mead as part of the Founding Narratives exhibit, is attributed to Robert Peckham, who, like Ora Hitchcock, worked with Edward to paint botanical specimens from Edward Hitchcock's work as a geologist. In the painting, you can see the octagon that Edward Hitchcock had attached to his home. And in this photograph on the right, which is from 1875, you can see, I think right here is Edward Hitchcock's house and the empty plot of land behind the house. The next set of characters who spent some significant time on the property are Morris Bird Kingsman and his mother, Catherine Kingsman. Morris was a graduate of the University of Massachusetts Agricultural College and worked as a florist on this property right next to the Hitchcock house. The 1900 census shows that both Morris and Catherine lived at the property, and you can see from the map that this was likely a little greenhouse. The map also shows the old Delta Upsilon fraternity house, and it notably doesn't show Hitchcock Road because it hadn't been created yet. But when it would go straight through the property that the Delta Upsilon fraternity had sat on. So finally, we get to Bailey Brown. And so again, the Bailey Brown house was built in 1932. And from the 1940 census, we see that Bailey Brown lived at the residence with his 3 children, Jerem, Diana, and Ridley Jr., his wife, Marion, and a servant named Stella Tomachak. Ridley was the son who had reached out to Biddy in 2013 about having the house named in honor of his father. So I learned from the Amherst College archives that Bailey Brown was quite a character. He graduated from Amherst College in 1924, and as a student, he was a member of the track team. And when he started teaching at Amherst College, he came out of athletic retirement and competed against the freshman track team, and apparently just demolished them in like the high jump and the sprint. They were no good. I was also pleased to learn that the namesake of the arts house had dipped his toes in the arts as well, as a participant in the Glee Club and a group called, yes, Mallory, Glee Club, the Octet, which I am not familiar with. His mathematics research was in the field of ring theory, a subject that I and fellow Amherst College math majors all get brief exposure to in our core course groups, rings and fields. Bailey Brown has sent 4 generations of students to Amherst College, and his great-grandson is actually a current student at the college. So the house remained in the Bailey Brown family until the death of Bailey Brown's wife, Marion, in 1989, at which point the house was sold to the college. Since then, it has been occupied by an athletic director, chief advancement officer, and several cohorts of Copeland fellows. In 2013, it became the Arts House for the Arts at Amherst Initiative, and in 2014, it was officially named the Bailey Brown House. Since taking over the residence, the Arts at Amherst Initiative has hosted over 500 artists in the home. And in the 2019-2020 academic year, this included 7 Grammy Award-winning artists, as well as multiple Amherst College alumni. When the house closed to outside guests in March 2020, it was really important to the steering committee that we found ways to support the local arts community. So we worked to select several pieces by local artists to add to the current artwork that's on display in the house. We're really looking forward to hosting an event where all the artists can come together in this space, but I'm hoping that the virtual tour will be a sneak peek at what that event could look like. And we hope at some point soon to be able to open the house once again to visiting artists as soon as it's safe to do so. So now let's jump into the virtual tour. I've been warned that the tour takes up a lot of my bandwidth, so I'm going to share in the chat a link in case you'd like to follow along on your own. All right, so welcome to the Bailey Brown House. Just to get you oriented, if you hover over the tags, or if you click on them, you should be able to get information about the object or the house. And then right here to our right, here's Edward Hitchcock's octagon. So heading in, welcome, welcome. You can put your coat right here. So this is the first work that I will draw your attention to. So this work is by Butler, and she's an artist and storyteller that's based in New Jersey. The original work is actually a quilt, and so this is just a very small print of a much larger work. I have a quote that she wrote about her artistic practice that I thought I would read. She writes, "I have always been drawn to portraits. I was the little girl who would sit next to my grandmother and ask her to go through old family photo albums. I was the one who wanted to hear the story behind every picture. I often start my pieces with a black and white photo and allow myself to tell the story. My pieces are told in the fabrics that I choose, the textures I combine, and the colors that create a whole new composition. My portraits tell stories that may have been forgotten over time. When you see the vintage lace and the aged satin, it tells a story of delicacy and refinement of times gone by. When you see African printed cotton and mud cloth, it tells the story of my ancestral homeland and the cradle of civilization. When you see multicolored organza and netting layered, you are being told a story of something or someone colorful and multifaceted." And this is one of the new pieces that we added to the home this year. The next one is by our very own Robert Sweeney, or Bob Sweeney. And we emailed back and forth a little bit about this work, and Bob let me know that it was from a painting trip to Italy. And he said that you could look across the valley that was in central Tuscany and see the hill town of Cortona. And I think that view was an inspiration for the painting. And yeah, this is one of the works that has been in the house since the initiative first acquired it and started using it as an artist residence. This next work is a new piece. And Danielle, do you want to hop in and say anything about this work or about Patrick?
Sure. Patrick is a Haitian American artist who tries to create works that draw on the cultural history of Black Americans, and he paints particularly from a Black Haitian experience. We connected with Patrick through work that he did with the campus. So if folks visit the Multicultural Resource Center in Keefe, Patrick created a site-specific painting for that center in partnership with students, faculty, and staff as part of a program that the Mead did called Red Eye Black Tie in 2018, I believe. And when there was opportunity to bring more visual art into the Bailey Brown House, Patrick came to mind as someone who was a really great collaborator on campus. This work is this painting, Esmeralda Sherry, is obviously a figurative work. Most of his work up to that point had been more abstract. He was starting to do figurative works as a way to explore family relationships. So this is actually a painting of one of his dear friend's grandmothers when she was young. So he's exploring old photographs and decided to paint her, and it's lovely, and we're happy to have it.
Thanks so much, Danielle. So now we'll make our way into the dining room, and we'll take a look at this work by Dave Gloman. So yeah, Dave is one of our own at Amherst, and we chatted over email a bit about this work. And he said that his practice is often directly outdoors. And so in creating this piece, he had he had his like mobile studio box truck, and so drove it down the Connecticut, set up shop, and found just a nice small path down a road, and yeah, created this very large painting down one of those very small roads. And then one more in the dining room. This is by Anna Hepler, who I first became familiar with from her works that were featured in the spring of 2020 in the Eli Marsh Gallery. I don't know if, hopefully maybe some of you saw that exhibit. She's currently a visiting lecturer in the Art and History of Art department. And this was one of the new works that we acquired in the past year. And now I will take you to the kitchen, or this is the breakfast nook, and I spend so much time in this breakfast nook and I love it. And we have the artist with us. So Naya, do you want to jump in and say anything about this work?
Hi. Yeah, so this piece is an example of a process that I don't have any kind of a fancy name for, but it's a kind of printmaking, a non-traditional printmaking. So I take two canvas panels and then apply paint with different viscosities to the surface and in different ways, and then press the two panels together and then peel them apart. And depending on how fast I peel them apart, depending on what kind of paint I use and how much, the paint, creates these veiny looking sort of textures, which, a lot of my work kind of makes reference to natural forms. And so that's one of the ways, but it's also kind of playful, I think, in the shapes that sort of emerge in this particular piece. And there's two of them. That's why it's a duo print. So there's a left and a right. And they're slightly different just because of the nature of the process. So I don't know if you want me to say anything else.
No, that's perfect. Thanks so much. Thank you.
you.
I should have given you a proper introduction. I'll say that Naya has done a lot of collaborative work with the Mead, especially this past year, and it's been lovely to get to know you better. And thank you for coming. I have to say, since I look at them every day, I started to notice the little differences between each one, and have very much enjoyed that part of those works. So we'll take a look at one more piece before we head upstairs. And this is a work by Kevin Pomerleau. Danielle, do you want to jump in again and say anything about Kevin?
Sure. Kevin is a wonderful local artist based in Northampton and does a lot of work out of ZMAs in Florence, if folks are familiar with that print shop. He's taught printmaking and has led workshops at ZMAs for Amherst College students, and also actually a group of students that the Mead was leading on a tour and an art collecting program were at the International Center for Printmaking, ICP-NY, and Kevin's work was on view, and it was kind of fortuitous that this group of Amherst College students had announced themselves as such, and Kevin was like, "Oh, I'm from Northampton," and that was sort of where the connection was born. And I think the works from these series were on view in that show. But Kevin has also been a wonderful collaborator at community days and other programs that we've hosted at the college. His printmaking is really based on textiles in natural spaces. So just a lot of, I think we'll see another print by him, so I won't speak again, but he looks at interior domestic spaces and really has a beautiful eye and I guess hand for recreating textiles and intimacy and warmth in interior spaces. So I think these are wonderful. And Ellen actually kind of curated the placement of these, and I just love the placement around the staircase. So great job, Kevin and Ellen.
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, so this is his other work, which is at the top of the stairs. And just two more artists. So these next two are photographs by Jordan Christopher, who's a photographer from Detroit that lives in Boston. And his work focuses on on race, class, and gender, as well as his own life experiences. And so this one on the right is titled M, and this one on the left is actually a self-portrait. And now we'll take a quick hop into one of the bedrooms. So this is the East Suite. And we have our last work, which is by Keller, who is professor of art at Amherst. She has a whole series of these that are around the house in all of the guest rooms. And I really enjoy the way they unite the space. Yeah. So with that, I think I'll hand off to Dwight. I'll let you, share a bit about how this connects to other research. And if people have questions, I'll let you moderate the brief Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you, Ellen, for all of the really great work that you've done. This is really fascinating. And one of the things that, working with you, I know that came up and that relates to the broader discipline is this issue of the difficulties that everyone encounters with when it comes to studying architecture. Part of the reason why architecture can be frustrating to study is the fact that, right, architecture is something that everyone has experience with. We all grow up spending our entire lives inside of buildings. Some of us own buildings, right, our houses or whatever. The thing is that because of that, oftentimes people tend to overlook architecture. They tend to have very harsh opinions about the buildings around them. They either label them as beautiful or ugly or valueless. And so, if you want, what that means for the study of architectural history is that if you want to study, say, the White House or the Eiffel Tower, that is fairly clear cut. You will be able to find documents that, tell you about when these buildings were constructed, how many laborers were involved in construction, although that can get spotty in a lot of ways. But in general, when it comes to canonical buildings, because these are structures that are seen by a lot of people as being beautiful and noteworthy, it is easy to find out information about them. They have records. What becomes difficult is the study of ordinary buildings, of the study of buildings that most people have and do live in, because these buildings oftentimes are not viewed as important in their time. And so what happens is, when you're an architectural historian and you go somewhere to study the architectural history that is vernacular or local, you'll end up asking people, or you'll meet people in the heritage and preservation world, or just people on the street who will say, oh, that building over there, it was built in 1725. And, everyone will say, oh, yeah, that's a 1725 building. It was built in the 18th century. And then you'll end up encountering is, well, okay, you'll ask people, how do you know that this building was built in 1725? And what people often say is, oh, well, everyone knows that. But then when you go try to actually hunt down where the actual document is that confirms that this building was built in 1725, don't be surprised if you cannot find that document. If that document does not exist, do not be surprised if that document has been lost or deliberately destroyed even. And I think that's one of the challenges of studying historic architecture, is that really this is a form of objecthood that is really, that people have a lot of strong opinions about, that people overlook, that people have a lot of myths about surrounding. And I think that that has come up in your own research, where you've run into challenges or dead ends. And so I was wondering if you could speak to us a little bit about the kinds of challenges, the kinds of dead ends that you've run into. What documents do you wish you could have found that could have verified something about this building that you weren't able to find? And then, I have another question that builds upon that, but I'm just curious to know, or I'd like to hear more about the impasses, the things you wish were there that are not there.
Yeah, that's a great question. Early on, I was really excited about trying to trace the history of the bricks, and very quickly realized that that was not going to be a very good approach. I know that on the brick, there's usually a print, and it's called the frog of the print and of the brick, and you can sometimes trace that back to a maker. But I wasn't about to take a brick out of the house, so I got stuck on that way of thinking about the project early on. And then I didn't really have records coming in the other way about from the Bailey Brown family, about who purchased the bricks. But something that I did find that only recently was that Edward Hitchcock has some writings about the bricks that he purchased for his home. And it takes me so long to read his handwriting that I left that project aside. But that seems like maybe there's some potential there, and probably his record keeping was a little bit better because he had to keep up records for the sake of the college, because what he was building was a building that was probably partially paid for by the college. Yeah, so that was a big dead end very early on.
Yeah. And then how did you fill in those gaps? I really think that your work or your research in the area of geology was really interesting. And one way that architectural historians have tried to fill in some of the gaps that might exist in terms of, material histories. If you want to know more about the bricks that are used to build a particular building and you don't have any other information, well, then you could look into, say, the processes of brick making that existed in a particular area, or you could even look into, you could do something that I've done in my own research, is that in my research on architecture and slavery in Mauritius, what I've started to do is literally take samples of the few remaining buildings from the era of transcultural enslavement that exist on the island of Mauritius, and then I've tested those samples from these ruins for their chemical composition to just know something about what materials are these buildings actually made of, because the archives will not oftentimes explicitly tell you. And in my research, there are only 8 buildings that still exist from this era that I'm studying. I think that's something that comes up a lot in architectural studies, is just the reality that so much has been destroyed. So much does not exist anymore, especially buildings that were buildings used and inhabited by people who were seen as inferior, people like slaves, servants. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you came across that might not exist anymore. I know that you attempted to do some research on a person who was a servant in this house, but then that was it didn't lead exactly in the way to it didn't exactly pan out, but I was wondering if you could describe that process.
Sure. Well, I'll first touch on like what you were saying about sort of studying the building materials themselves, because I remember you bringing that up in a previous talk and was like, oh, we could totally do that with the bricks. And realize that you can't just do that with any object. The reason that works with coral structures is because they're organic and they retain some like information about the date that they were made. The glacial clay isn't like, you can't date when it was made into a brick. It's all, to my understanding, all of the clay throughout the Connecticut and Hudson River Valley will come back with probably similar chemical attributes. And so I was like, I guess that won't work for bricks, but it would work for wood, probably.
Yeah.
And then in terms of like what doesn't the other question you asked about the servant, yeah, I was excited to see how far I could go down that path, because the early census data, you can see not only the names of everyone that lives in a house, but you can see the exact address and the names of every single person in the household for a couple of decades, in the early, I think like 1920s to maybe 1960. And yeah, I tried to trace what happened to that woman, and it seems like she was born in Amherst and grew up in Hadley. And then there are records of her passing away quickly after the 1940 census, but there's issues of like, is that exactly her name? There's like another person that has a very similar name and just like one letter is being shifted. And yeah, that made it very challenging to be able to trust that what I was finding was true, and was like even the same person.
No, I think that's interesting, and it relates to this reality that in studying this history of the land, of buildings, of local history, right? There's so much that's lost. And I think it's about really embracing that loss, the void of the historical record. It's very powerful, but it leaves a lot of questions. And, one way that architectural historians have tried to fill that void is through theory, right? A theoretical perspective can help you to conceptualize that which is missing. Of course, if you're desiring an empirical reality or a document or a vestige, oftentimes in this line of research, you might be disappointed because the question becomes how much is there? Of course, archaeology is a different story. I mean, it's interesting to think what would happen if we started to, perform excavations at the site. What would we find? And so that leads me to my other question, and I'll pass this on to other people after I ask this question, but what do you think we could do in terms of future research? What do you see, if another arts coordinator was to take on this project, what do you think are the lines of future research that someone should or could follow?
Well, something that I think I left a bit untapped is not so much the architectural, but like getting to know the people that lived in the house a little bit more. I think there's a ton of information about Bailey Brown and the 4 generations of his family that is available and would be accessible. And then another train of thought that I was sort of excited about was, I was curious if in the land itself there's like some chemical record of the fact that there was a florist right there. And I don't know if there are like pesticides or something like that you can see in that record. And then the last thing that I thought would be really fun for the initiative to do, I know that Emily Potter-Nadai and Chris Durr did this really cool project pairing together some like the chemistry of the rocks that are used to make pigments with like paintings that are on display in the Mead. And I think it would be such a fun project to try to weave together the geologic history with like rock samples and then tie them to like pigments that are on of paintings that are on display in the house. Super like cross-disciplinary and
I mean, yeah, no, that's a great idea. And one thing I've just thought of is that when looking at the bricks on the facade of the house, I mean, the thing is that you might be able, through testing of samples, you might be able to determine how well made the bricks are, or, you know, how sturdy they are. I mean, I imagine that they're pretty sturdy because they're still there. They're still on the house, but
I hope so. I'm still here.
you might be able to determine whether or not there's been a history of restoration. So are we looking at, you know, brick that does in fact correlate with the kind of brick that people were able to make at the time, or are we looking at something that has been modified or restored, or, you know, over time? You could determine that perhaps.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I think we have time for like a question or two from the audience if anybody has, or if everybody's running off to dinner, I completely understand.
I mean, I'd just like to say that you know, this is a really interesting resource, and I really hope that maybe next year we could come back and someone could build upon the work that you've done, and then maybe the arts coordinator after that could do, you know, build upon that, and it could be we could actually begin to create an archive where no archive existed before, right, of this structure and the people from all walks of life who have built this structure, lived in this structure, and visited. So I think that is a possibility here.
Danielle, do you want to ask a question?
Well, it's not a question, but I just wanted to compliment you on the wonderful presentation. I went to graduate school for art history and heard many architectural historians present, and none of them have ever started in geology. And I just thought that was and I know you're really passionate about geology, and I love the way you actually melded that passion with this presentation, and it was enlightening and enriching, and I think it totally aligns with everything that the initiative is. So kudos for that move. And thank you so much for all of your research and for sharing it with us today and inviting artists into the space as well. Like, thank you, Naya, for being here. And Ellen, thank you for coordinating it. I also wanted to say that this is likely our last program that's going to be organized and facilitated by Ellen as our arts coordinator, as her term is coming to an end. And I'm really sad about that, and I'm like happy that this is the note that we're ending on, because it was such a wonderful presentation. But I mean, I invite I know a lot of love has been left in the chat, but you can throw up a virtual applause and a heart to say thank you to Ellen. Don't spotlight me, keep the spotlight on yourself. For everything that she's done for the initiative over the past 2 years. Obviously COVID was a disaster, but it meant that we would get to keep Ellen for an extra year, which was a sort of added joy for all of us, and get to hear this wonderful presentation. So thank you, Ellen, for tonight and for all of the programming and work that you've done for the initiative thus far. Wanted to say that publicly. So thank you. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, all right. Well, thank you all for coming. It was really lovely to have you all, and I hope you enjoyed the wine and cheese.